We want to make a mind-boggling cutting board? Okay, let's walk through the process. We're going to make one from start to finish and go over the tips and the efficiencies to make it much easier than, well, what it looks. Do we still play the intro stinger? First, I gotta decide, is it gonna be an in-grain cutting board or a face grain cutting board? In-grain cutting boards show less cut marks. However, they also are a lot more labor intensive. However, they can look really cool. So that's what we're gonna make. All right, let's figure out the size and dimensions. Those are gonna be based off the purpose of the cutting board, the aesthetics we're going for, and then the tools and the methods we're gonna use. The tools and the methods, well, we're gonna talk about that later because we're literally gonna build a cutting board. So the first two things. If we're gonna use it to cut giant chunks of meat, well, we probably want a pretty large cutting board. My preference is to stick with something close to the golden ratio. The golden ratio is this concept that there are things in nature that just have an aesthetically pleasing ratio between the width and the length. Now to figure that out, we say, what is our desired width? And you times that by 1.618. That will tell you dimensions on what the length should be. My cutting boards are usually between 11.5 to 13 inches wide. So if I were to do that and say 11.5 inches times 1.618, well, that gives me 18 and close to 5/8 of an inch long. These are just rough dimensions. I like to prioritize what the pattern looks like, then the width, and then the length, in that order. The reason why I do that is because the pattern, well, that's what looks really cool. The width kind of lets my eye notice the pattern easier. And then the length, well, that can be adjusted a bit easier than the width can. So that's why I have it in that order. So at this point, we need to find a pattern that we're gonna use, and then that will allow us to figure out what size materials we need. I like to find inspirational pictures, especially geometric patterns, and then I can create a customized version that fits my needs. Consider our design a bunch of individual boards that are all glued together into a row. That row is a wood panel. Well, then we look right below that, and we can identify another row. That's also a wood panel. And then when we take all these wood panels and we stick them together, we make something magical. What we're getting into is project design, and that could be a whole video on its own. There's lots of tips and tricks when it comes to this kind of stuff. Now, luckily, there's a great resource for this, which is today's sponsor, Woodworkers Good of America. Woodworkers Good of America is your online resource for woodworking instructions, ideas, and information. They cover a variety of design topics, like they have an article on SketchUp for woodworkers. Now, I haven't used SketchUp in a long time, and I'm a bit rusty, and I really need to brush up on my skills, so now I know where to go. But how about videos on designing project pieces using CAD software, or design considerations for cabinet making? Woodworkers Good of America even has a 3-part video series on the essentials of good project design. I eat this stuff up, and one reason is because their site has so many premium instructional videos taught by professional woodworkers that are giving you kind of the tips of the trade. These super smart instructors are all part of the Woodworkers Good of America community of passionate woodworkers who all want to improve on their craft. Woodworkers Good of America has a special offer that the first 1,000 of you can unlock if you go down and click on the link in the video description or scan the QR code. They're offering a full year's premium membership to Woodworkers Good of America for only $1.49. This is for new members only. I'm telling you, you're not going to regret it. They have amazing content. So thank you to Woodworkers Good of America for sponsoring this video. Now, when it comes to my design, I think I know what I'm going to do. I want to make a plaid cutting board. I've got several plaid projects. I think they look rad, so we're going to go with that. Now, I do recommend, whatever the pattern is, that we draw out a scale model version of it. We don't have to go crazy with this. We could use notebook paper or graph paper or whatever. Really what's important is looking at the proportions and the ratios and seeing this board next to that board and the size comparison. Personally, I like to use a vector software like Inkscape, which you could download for free. Now, don't be intimidated by this type of software. It's really easy to use, especially because we're only going to draw some basic shapes. We're going to draw some rectangles and then move them around to whatever order that we like. So you'll pick up on it really quick. It's easier if we use the same dimensions for multiple sections. For instance, if I'm going to use 1/4 inch maple stripes and I'm already going to put walnut stripes in it, well, I might as well make those 1/4 inch too. That's just going to save me a time so that I'm milling and cutting my boards all at the same time instead of having to reset up tools. That's the kind of stuff I like to think about whenever I'm doing design work. Now, if you really want to up your game, you could go with a 3D modeling software like Fusion 360. Now, these are powerful tools. You don't have to use it for a bunch of crazy stuff though. What I like about it is I can move my project in different angles and then determine, yep, that's the design I'm looking for. I like to consider what lumber I have or what I can obtain whenever I'm making my design choices. So if my pattern calls for 2-inch squares, well, do I have lumber that's 2 inches thick so I can get those squares out of it? Or am I willing to glue boards together to get that? Well, that may dictate what I want to do with this. Also, when I'm looking at my lumber, I want to make sure I'm looking at the end because I'm making an in-grain cutting board. So this is the part that's really going to be seen, not this part. And well, you could accidentally pick out some pretty ugly stuff by just avoiding looking at the end. I got a piece of maple that I think looks pretty good. It's just gonna take some work to get at it. Milled up some pretty big boards here. Thing is whenever you do that, you're exposing the inside of the wood to, well, the outside. That means the moisture content's gonna change, and these boards could twist and bow and turn. So good practice is to pre-mill. Milled all these up, I'm gonna set them here for a day or two, then I'll come back, mill them again, cut them into all their strips, and then that's gonna give me a more stable cutting board. Now that my boards have acclimated and I milled them up again, it's time to start cutting these up into pieces. Well, when I do that, I'm gonna start thinking about the grain flow. Do I want my grain to flow from like top to bottom, side to side, alternate, top, bottom, side, side? All that really matters when it comes to aesthetics. So what I'm thinking is, the grain is flowing like this. Well, if I want my grain to go top to bottom, then maybe I'll cut pieces that are like right here. Well, I'll have top to bottom. And then this way, I'll flip these pieces over and have this be the top and the bottom. All I really have to do is take this one right here and rotate it 90 degrees, and then the grain will be going up and down, just like this side. And well, all the stuff in the middle here, well, it's all the same, doesn't matter. I guess this leads to another tip, which is it does really help to draw on your boards where you want to cut at, because, well, then you are more likely to cut where you want to cut at. Learn from experience. It always helps me to line everything up so I can see if the grain's flowing the way it's supposed to and if all the blocks line up. And then whenever they do, I just take some chalk and I'll mark it so I can make sure I glue them up the way that this looks. I'm using Type Bond 3 waterproof glue for this because it's a cutting board and we're gonna wanna wash it at some point, right? So that means we need to have waterproof glue. Also, all of these pieces are a little bit oversized, as in they're the right width, but thickness, they're a little bit thicker. That's because, well, I'm gonna have to plane and sand this down later on. That's one of the most common questions I get when it comes to cutting boards, is people say, well, I wanted to have 1-inch squares, and whenever I got all done with this whole thing, they're not 1 inches anymore. They're like fat little rectangles instead. Well, it's because we have to glue this up, and we've got to plane it down, and we've got to combine it with the other panel we're gonna glue up, and then plane all those down. And eventually, it just is not gonna be a square anymore. So to counteract that, we make it a little bit thicker, and then we can remove some material and then flatten it down so it is 1 inch. I am gluing together extra boards of my pattern. This is not gonna be the final size of my cutting board. I like to have some extra ones on the edges because you never know, you're trying to do something with this and you have some chip out, some tear out over on the edges that wouldn't happen if you had an extra board there. So I like to have that, and also it just gives me some more flexibility because I might find that one board's a little bit in a certain spot, I don't like it, but if my panel's extra wide, I can always shift it left or right whenever I'm gluing together with that second panel, and gives me a better looking cutting board. We got to flatten the panels after glue up. Now there's multiple ways to do that. You could use a planer, a sander, a router, a CNC if you're lucky enough. So don't feel like you're pigeonholed to only use one tool. But I do recommend considering what tool you're going to use when you're making your design. In my case, this planer can only plane up to 12.5-inch wide panels. Well, my pattern's a little bit wider than that, so I can't use this one. During the first glue up, I said I like to keep the panels a little bit thicker and then I'll flatten them down. And that's where a combination square is indispensable for me. So what I do is I'll figure out what the width is of the squares in my pattern. And I'll set my combination square to that. Then as I'm sanding or planing my panels down, I'll keep checking it until the thickness of it matches my combination square. Then I know I have perfect squares. I need to cut each one of these panels into slices. And those slices need to be the same thickness as what my cutting board's gonna be, plus a little bit of extra, because I'm still gonna have to flatten this cutting board when it's all said and done, and I'm gonna lose a little bit of material. So if I want a cutting board that's 1.25 inches thick, I need to cut each one of these panels into slices that are slightly above 1.25 inches. I've got a stop block set here, and I'm just gonna take each one of these and cut, 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 and keep cutting. I'm gonna cut as many slices as I can out of these, and that's really what you want, because then you can pick and choose which ones you need for your pattern. There might be some parts of this that, you know, you look at it and you go, it's just not as good as other sections. I could throw those away. Or we don't know what's inside one of these boards. You might cut it open and see like an ugly looking spot that you don't want on your cutting board. This also lets you customize the length of the cutting board. So the more slices you have, the longer the cutting board can be. For example, if my pattern requires 16 slices, then I need to go, all right, my slices are 1.25 inches thick, and then my kerf my saw blades, another 1/8 of an inch times 16. I usually cut the last slice or two at the table saw using a fence. I know I could cut the entire thing like this, but I feel like I have a little bit more control using the sled compared to having, you know, a smaller edge and this long cutting board piece sticking way out and trying to make those cuts. There's nothing wrong with doing it that way. It's just you got to figure out the method that works best for you. Take your time during the glue up. This one's going to be really important. We got to make sure that our pattern lines up as best as possible. Now what I like to do is look at the center of it and then move outward, because your eye looks at the center of the cutting board first. And then once I get it kind of lined up, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll use a center clamp. So I'll clamp it as I go. Just depends on how the pattern is lining up. But I like to apply pressure across the middle of it, not the ends first, because it just holds the pattern in place a little bit better for me anyways. I was able to pick and choose which boards I wanted for this because I cut a lot of them. And I made sure that I cut enough so that I can make a whole other cutting board over there. And I guess that's one of the tips I have, is that this is a lot of work. And you know, you're gonna make this and someone's gonna look at it and go, I want one of those. You might as well batch them out. There's always more than one way to make a cutting board. Now for me, I don't like to use tiny pieces if I can help it. So I want to have the biggest pieces possible. Well, with this cutting board pattern, I'm going to have really long, thin stripes. I could have built in thin stripes in each one of those panels. And then as I sliced them up, put them all together. But then I would have very thin pieces that I have to get aligned all the way down, and lots of them. And also sideways too. I would prefer just to have it where all of that is just one long board, because then it's just gonna look better for the eye. So what I did was milled up a whole bunch of thin maple. I'm gonna glue these together and make a really, really wide, thin panel. Once I get all glued up, I can just cut this into strips, flip those over on their ends so it's in grain, and then put those stripes into my cutting board. I cut my thin panels into slices. Now, whenever I put these upright, they're gonna be in grain and I can embed them into my cutting board. And the great thing about this is, since they're all one long piece, it's gonna be a straight line compared to having a whole bunch of little pieces that I had to try to glue up and align just perfectly. So now I'm gonna take my cutting board, I'm gonna cut it into a whole lot of pieces, and I'm gonna take these stripes and embed them into that dude. I think this is a great example of that there's always more than one way to do something. There's nothing wrong with incorporating those stripes with the original glue ups, and there's nothing wrong with the way that I'm doing it. Just kind of have to figure out what method works best for you. When we're cutting an in-grain cutting board, pretty much all of our cuts are going to be cross-grain, which means you can have a lot of splintering, tear out on the backside. So to help prevent that, I like to use a sacrificial board. I know my sled already has a kerf in it. but there could be a little wiggle room. That curve might be a little bit wider than what I really want. Having this board here, I can get a brand new curve, and that means I'm gonna get cleaner cuts. After so many glue-ups, you may see that your pattern is slightly askew. It may look great, but is it parallel to one of the edges there? So if you're gonna take it and cut it at your table saw and just cut a straight line, would it cut perfectly down your pattern, or would it kind of be a little bit off? Well, it's pretty common for it to be a little bit off. Not a big deal though. What I like to do is just use some paper as shims. So I can set my cutting board in my sled here, line it up to how I want it to be cut, use the paper to shim it in place, and then make my cuts. That just helps to realign everything so the outside dimensions are parallel to the pattern. My cutting board's flat. I've cut it to the size, the pattern that I like. Now it needs something to make it easy to pick up, because you've got to sit on a work surface like your counter and you go to pick it up and it can be a little bit difficult. So some people will put like a handle, or they'll route out, something here, some notches. I like to do just a subtle chamfer around all the edges. So at the table saw, I'm gonna put my blade at 45 degrees, just buzz a little bit off, just so you can get your fingers in there, lift that up. To me, there's no hard and fast rule on how much material to remove. Usually just cut a little bit off, take a look at it, and then just decide, do I want to cut more or not? If you do this, I recommend using some painter's tape or maybe a sacrificial board. Just something to back up those edges, because whenever you make that cut, well, it's easy to get some tear out whenever the blade exits the cutting board. Okay, now it's time for a heck of a lot of sanding. Now with cutting boards, I like to sand up to 220 grit, and I'm gonna start with 120 grit, and that's because I have 120 grit in my drum sander. Otherwise, I might actually go down to like 80 grit, and that's because sanding in grain can take a really long time. It's just a slow process. Now, what I do recommend though is changing your sandpaper out a lot. And even if that sandpaper feels like, well, this is pretty good, maybe throw on a new piece and try it out. Yeah, you'll go through more sandpaper, but it'll probably save you hours and hours of time. My process is to scribble the entire thing with a pencil. That way, whenever I'm sanding, I know what areas I missed and what I didn't. I'm also gonna use a hard pad in my sander. It's gonna help me to make sure my cutting board stays flat. I don't sand like a hump into this thing. After I sand the whole surface, I'm gonna look really close to see, are there any lines in it, like grooves from my drum sander or a tool? And if there are, that means I need to sand the entire surface again. I'm gonna keep doing that. I'm not gonna move up to the next grit until that surface is completely flat. Then it's just rinse and repeat. Scribble the whole surface, sand, and then inspect. Are there any swirl marks? Are there any lines? Anything that needs to be sanded away? If so, keep sanding. If not, move up in grit. I sand everything with 220 grit. Now, one thing I like to do is to raise the grain just by wiping it with some water. Some folks say you don't have to do this because it's end grain. Whenever you get wood wet, the grain raises. The end grain doesn't raise as much as the face grain, but I will say this, at least the outside perimeter is face grain. So when your cutting board gets wet from washing it, all of that is going to raise up. If we get it wet now and then we let it dry and we sand it back, then it won't do it as noticeably in the future. I can only go off my experience. And my experience is that even the end grain does raise up. It doesn't do it nearly as noticeable as the face grain, but it still does. So I like to do the end grain too. I mean, it only adds a couple minutes and it ensures that I have a super smooth cutting board. Here's an option for you. Instead of this thing sliding around on the countertop, you can actually put some feet on the bottom of it. I typically don't do this. However, this is a plaid pattern. It looks classy, and I've got some brass feet, and I think it'd be a nice touch. Plus, it helps out with the whole sliding thing. All right, we're in the home stretch. It is time to apply finish. Now, I like to keep it simple with mine. I'm just gonna use some oil and wax mixed. Now, I know some people will take their cutting board and they'll soak it in mineral oil overnight. That's perfectly fine. I've tried that myself. Problem is that it would leave like an oily residue on my counter a year later, and I don't wanna deal with that. I don't wanna give a cutting board to somebody and they deal with that. So instead, again, just some butcher block oil absolutely works. You apply it to the surface, you buff it in, let it sit there and soak for a bit, wipe off any of the extra, you're good to go. If it ever looks dull, add a little bit more and, well, your cutting board looks brand new. really like how this project turned out, and I have to say, I'm digging those brass feet. I might have to put those on a future project. Well, hopefully these tips helped you out. I can't wait to hear about some of the cutting boards you end up making. Until we meet again, get in your shop and build something awesome.